Welcome to the second annual Catholic Political Thought Lecture. This afternoon, Thomism Goes to War. A perfect day to have the name of Thomas in the title. Thanks for joining us, including the people who are watching online. My name is Russell Hittinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at Catholic University, as well as one of three co-directors of the program of Catholic Political Thought. At the outset, I'd like to extend special thanks to Dr. Peter Kilpatrick, President of the Catholic University of America, for being here today, as he was last year. I'd especially like to thank the IHE staff, Stephen Higgins, Managing Director of IHE, who does excellent work in planning and executing not only this event, but many others. And since we're talking about Thomas going to war, special recognition for two experts in Catholic just war theory, George Weigel, who is with us today, and Joseph Capizzi. So special thanks for them to be here today. I also need to express our gratitude to the law school, the project on constitutional originalism and the Catholic intellectual tradition. These two programs have worked hand in glove with IHE on many events, both on and off campus. And probably our most important cooperator, Father Dominic Lake and the Thomistic Institute, organizing really quality, intellectual quality conferences, both here and overseas. Thank you, Father Dominic. A few words about IHE. We're probably, in the Catholic world anyway, the leading institute committed to identifying conditions that are conducive to human flourishing, and doing so in an interdisciplinary perspective, leaving all other schools and departments and academic specialties intact. We are a sort of lymph system operating through an institution without tampering with the work and the autonomy that genuinely belongs to other programs. I would say we do four things, at least four things. We sponsor lectures and colloquia for faculty and students, various departments here, but various schools and institutions across the nation and the world. We assist faculty in pursuing and disseminating their scholarship. We host twice a semester a John Courtney Murray dinner seminar for scholars in DC and at Catholic U. We have a bar, we have a dinner, and we talk for 2 hours on a certain book. And we host this series, of Catholic Political Thought. And one of the co-directors, besides myself, is Dr. Bradley Lewis, who will introduce our speakers. Dr. Lewis is an associate professor of philosophy here at CUA and a co-director of the political program. This academic year, speaking of war and peace, he is serving as the resident ethics fellow at the United States Naval Academy. So, with that, I think I will turn everything over to Brad. Where's Brad? There he is. Good. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks very much, Russ. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, in part because of who he is, but also because today's lecture makes good on our promise at last year's lecture that would be an inaugural lecture, suggesting that it would be the first in a series, indeed an annual series. And we began that series very memorably last year with a wonderful lecture by Russ Hittinger that's since been published in Nova et Vetera, and will appear again in a collection of Russ's writings that will be published by Catholic University of America Press later this year. The Catholic Political Thought Lecture is an integral component of the program in Catholic Political Thought, which is sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology and constitutes a collaborative interdisciplinary center of research and teaching here at Catholic University, made up of faculty and students in the schools of theology, philosophy, and the Department of Politics. It is the only program of its kind, and it is growing. The program's aim is to pass on the wisdom of the Catholic tradition of reflection on political life to students, to develop and extend it as a living tradition, and to make it available to the wider public in line with Catholic University's motto, in service to church and nation, and our founder, Leo XIII's prayer that Catholic University give to the Republic its best citizens. So our speaker today to deliver this year's Catholic Political Thought Lecture is Professor Gregory M. Reichberg. He is research professor at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, where he has worked since 1998. He began his academic career here in the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America, and has also taught at Fordham University and at the University of Oslo. He holds a licentiate degree from the University of Toulouse and a doctorate from Emory University. In addition to, by my count, which is probably an undercount, he's published over 75 scholarly articles, and he's the author of Thomas Aquinas on War and Peace, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, which really is the essential work on the topic. He's currently at work on a book on just war in the Catholic tradition. Dr. Reichberg is also an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences since 2016, and a consultor to the Dicastery on Integral Human Development since 2020. Dr. Reichberg's lecture today is entitled Thomists Go to War. Now, following the lecture, we will hear responses from three very distinguished scholars who I want to introduce now, and then you'll hear them in that order. Andrew Latham is professor of political science at Macalester University, where he teaches international relations and specializes in the politics of international conflict and security. He's the author of Medieval Sovereignty from Amsterdam University Press in 2022, and Theorizing Medieval Geopolitics from Routledge 2012, in addition to which he has written a novel about the Third Crusade. Valerie Morkavicius is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science Department at Colgate University, where she specializes in international relations, just war, and international humanitarian law. She's the author of Realist Ethics, Just War Traditions as Power Politics from Cambridge University Press 2018. Our third respondent was supposed to be Daniel Philpott, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, where he teaches political theory and the ethics of international relations. He's the author of Revolutions in Sovereignty from Princeton in 2001, Just and Unjust Peace and Ethics of Political Reconciliation, Oxford 2012, and Religious Freedom in Islam, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Unfortunately, at this moment, Professor Philpott is stranded in O'Hare Airport, I believe, due to the kind of weather that people from that part of the country are quite used to. But he did send his remarks, and so when we get to that point, after the first two responses, I will read Professor Philpott's remarks. With that, please welcome Dr. Reichberg.
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure being here. As noted, I started my career here as an assistant professor. I have so many good memories of my time those days. I lived on campus with my wife in Centennial Village as a dorm master, so it was really quite moving to walk around. I haven't been on most of the campus for, well, at least 30 years. So it's an honor to be invited back. Oh. Alongside St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas is often credited with being an initiator of what has come to be called the Catholic tradition of just war. Indeed, Aquinas' short Summa Theologiae article, Whether Any War is Licit, has spawned many pages of commentary. It remains a key point of reference to the present day. This article has had such an impact in large measure because of its succinctness. A war will be just, Thomas writes, provided it is conducted by a legitimate authority, for a just cause, and with the right intention. In other places, he hints at some additional requirements. Last resort, net gain over harm done, reasonable hope of success, proportionality of means, and non-combatant distinction. Appeal to these criteria has remained the standard armature by which to assess the morality of specific armed engagements. A recent opinion piece in the New York Times, for instance, deploys these requirements to assess Israel's military actions in the current war against Hamas. The piece was written by Walter Dorn, entitled Measuring Israel by the Just War Yardstick. In his question on war, Thomas says little, and in fact nothing at all, about wars underway in his own day, or even his wars that took place historically. He hardly mentions the wars that appear in the Old Testament. His interest was directed more to the moral precepts that could be derived from the practice of the ancient Israelites. For instance, he has a short discussion of Deuteronomy 20:10. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. Thomas reads this as a teaching about last resort, namely that before initiating war, other remedies must be exhausted. First and foremost, the adversary must be given an opportunity to make amends, with the implication that their refusal to offer satisfaction for a wrong done would alone justify the aggrieved party resort to war. But of the wars themselves that were carried out by the Israelites, Aquinas contents himself with saying that these are best understood in a figurative or mystical sense, namely as signifying something other than war taken literally. For example, the individual soul's struggle with temptation, the moral imperative of maintaining confidence in God against all obstacles, or proclaiming His word vis-a-vis those who would oppose it. In fact, Aquinas placed the idea of just combat, understood logically by reference to physical fighting, at the heart of his teaching, both about martyrdom and the sacrament of confirmation. I discussed this when my son was to be confirmed. In Norway, everyone gives a speech on such occasions. And I'll try to, take a look at how Aquinas handled the sacrament of confirmation. And this is among others. By confirmation, the baptized receive from the Holy Spirit strength for engaging in spiritual combat. Bishops are like generals, and the chrism placed on the confirmant's forehead, St. Thomas likens to the military insignia placed on the forehead of soldiers. The military function should metaphorically be predicated of a sacrament. In this case, confirmation, this is how St. Thomas held the military function in high esteem. In his question on war, Thomas says little and in fact nothing at all about wars underway in his own day, or even historically. He hardly mentions the wars that appear in the Old Testament. His interest was directed more to the moral precepts. Oh, I've already said that. Sorry. I need to be more orderly with the positioning of my papers. Okay, here we are. On some rare occasions, St. Thomas does occasionally allude, albeit indirectly, to the wars of his own day. In his discussion of whether a religious order can be directed to soldiering, he speaks approvingly of those who take up arms in support of the Holy Land, a clear reference to the crusading initiatives of the Knights Templar, about which St. Bernard had spoken so glowingly. Anyhow, apart from this allusion to conflict then underway in the Holy Land, and unfortunately there still is conflict in the Holy Land, Aquinas had little to say about the wars of his own time. In contrast to St. Augustine, who as bishop maintained a copious correspondence with various Roman officials about matters of current concern, repression of the Donatist heresy, for instance. Even when discussing the question of capital punishment imposed on heretics, Thomas breathed not a word about the Albigensian War that had so engaged his confreres some 50 years before he wrote the Summa. Nonetheless, St. Thomas had more than passing acquaintance with matters military. He was raised in a family of knights. Around the age of 15, his parents moved him to Naples from Monte Cassino because of warfare that was coming progressively closer to the Benedictine Abbey, where he had been sent as an oblate. And as you know, the monastery was destroyed during the Second World War and then rebuilt. Thomas cites works on military strategy by Roman authors, and even went so far as to assign a special mode of prudence, prudentia militaris, for the moral regulation of strategic decision-making by military leaders. This was a unique contribution unparalleled by other theologians of his day. The harsh realities of war touched Thomas most closely in connection with his brother Renaud. Renaud was a knight who had originally sworn allegiance to the Emperor Frederick II, but changed sides after Pope Innocent IV deposed Frederick in 1246. Renaud was eventually captured by Frederick's army and was subsequently executed for the crime of lèse-majesté. This was a source of great sadness for Thomas's family. They considered Renaud a martyr. Indeed, Thomas had a dream in which his deceased sister, Marotta, appeared to him and recounted how Renaud was with her in heaven. And she said another of the brothers was still in purgatory. Yeah. Most likely with Renaud in mind, Thomas took up the issue of soldierly martyrdom in his earliest treatise, the commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, apropos of a wider discussion about the aureoles, the halos, saints receive in heaven. On this understanding, a special aureole was reserved for martyrs. Here, Thomas asks whether soldiers who die in defense of their country can be considered martyrs. At this juncture, a doubt is raised that this would be inconsistent with Christian practice, and Thomas writes in the objection, should someone die for the safeguard of his country while fighting in a just war, a bellum justum, an aureole would not be due to him, and this applies even if he is killed for safeguarding the faith that is in him. This represents the very first mention of just war in Thomas's corpus. But before telling you how he replied to this objection, let me scroll forward 700 or so years. On August the 7th, 1914, Belgium was invaded by Germany. Belgium put up an honorable resistance. Many of its soldiers died on the battlefield. Later that year, in his Christmas pastoral letter entitled Patriotism and Endurance, the Thomist, Cardinal Mercier, affirmed the salvific value of military service unto death. Christ crowns military valor, he wrote. Death, Christianly accepted, assures to the soldier the salvation of his soul. Mercier's fellow cardinal, Louis Biot of France, objected to these words. To say that the mere fact of dying consciously for the just cause of the fatherland suffices to assure salvation, Biot wrote in response, would amount to substituting the fatherland for God, a substitution that can by no means be allowed. For Biot, this would amount to an undue conflation of nationalism and faith. How would St. Thomas parse this question? Would he support Mercier over Biot or vice versa? In typical fashion, we find him affirming both claims, yet putting each in its proper place. With Mercier, he agrees that service to one's country in a just war is indeed a morally good act, and if uplifted by charity, this act will be meritorious. In other words, conducive to eternal life. On a par with the other naturally good acts that we carry out in our daily lives, teaching school children, providing medical care for the sick, or giving this lecture, hopefully. But because fighting on the battlefield is ordered to an inherently natural good, the common good of the temporal polity, these just warriors who die in the process may very well be received into heaven, but they will not merit the aureole of martyrs. The obstacle to receiving the aureole is not that they die sword in hand, a limiting condition that was only codified much later in church teaching, a condition that St. Thomas did not yet acknowledge. In Thomas's eyes, the obstacle rather is that these warriors do not die testifying explicitly to their faith in Christ. In this respect, Thomas agrees with B.O. But here Thomas adds a caveat where he nods to Mercier, and now I quote, "If someone sustains death defending his country against the attack of an enemy who is endeavoring to undermine the faith of Christ, then that person will merit the aureole and he will be a martyr." So Thomas's sister was right about Renaud. He should rightly be counted among the martyrs because his military service was on behalf of a supernatural good, namely the good of Christ's church under the leadership of the Pope, or so Thomas reasoned. From the 13th to the 17th century, a growing number of theologians discussed the ethics of war, often by writing commentaries on Aquinas' Summa Question 40 on war. But like Aquinas, their analyses hovered in the realm of speculation. The just war teaching was not yet marshaled to assess the rights and wrongs of ongoing conflicts. This changed dramatically when Francesco de Victoria gave his famous lecture, De Indis, on the Indians, at the University of Salamanca, around 1534. The lecture was directed to a very concrete issue, namely whether and on what grounds Spain could be justified in using armed force against the Native Americans. Victoria artfully divided his treatment into two sets of arguments, one dealing with illegitimate titles of conquest and the other with possible legitimate titles. Victoria is most often cited in connection with the illegitimate titles, as here he speaks on behalf of the rights of indigenous peoples, and in so doing, Victoria gives solace to the anti-colonial sentiments that are so prevalent in our own time. Victoria nonetheless appears in a less flattering light when he advances some justifying reasons that to his mind might rightly have motivated the Spaniards to wage war on the Amerindians. Among these reasons, he mentions how the Native Americans had wrongly impeded the Spaniards' natural right of free travel and free trade in the New World. This right was essential, Victoria thought, to the building up of friendship between peoples. On this reasoning, the Spaniards had sound reason to secure free trade by resort to armed force. Such an argumentation would surely have been met with Admiral Perry's approval 3 centuries later when he compelled Japan to open itself to Western trade. Perry thereby saw fit to negotiate under the barrel of a cannon, as the nations of East Asia would later object. Another rationale for just war that would likewise echo loudly in the years ahead was Victoria's contention that the Amerindians had made themselves liable to armed attack when they obstructed the spread of Christianity on their lands. It was to a rationale such as this that the theological supporters of Generalissimo Franco appealed when they sought to justify his forcible overthrow of the democratically elected Republican government of Spain in July 1936. In fact, these theologians went well beyond what Victoria had claimed. Along with St. Thomas, Victoria thought that a just war could be waged in the interests of Christendom. Franco's theologians held, in addition, that such a war should be deemed holy, a term employed neither by St. Thomas nor Victoria. Thus, toward the middle of the 20th century, we are confronted with the disturbing spectacle of prominent theologians, mostly Thomists, openly advocating for a holy war against the Republican half of Spain, many of whom were fellow Catholics. on grounds that they, along with the communists, were endangering the inherently Catholic identity of Spain. I have on my bookshelf a volume entitled Guerra Santa, published in Burgos, which is the seat of the Franco government, by one Aniceto de Castro Albarán, a canon of Salamanca. The book bears an approving preface by Cardinal Goma, then Primate of Spain. Albarán used Thomistic arguments for the justification of a holy war, arguing that the Spanish Second Republic had been a tyranny, an anarchy, a revolution. Our war is holy, Albarán said. Our battle cry will be that of the Crusades. God wills it. Long live Catholic Spain. And before writing these lines, Albarán had written a book about the right to rebellion against unjust rule, drawing on Thomas Aquinas. Arguments such as these were subsequently repeated in Argentina during the Dirty War, and in Chile to justify the overthrow of Allende and the repression that followed. Ideas have consequences. It was in 1937 that Jacques Maritain entered the fray. Having recently given a series of lectures in the Basque country of northern Spain, lectures that formed the basis of his groundbreaking and controversial work, Integral Humanism, Maritain sharply objected to the Francoist characterization of their military offensive as a holy war. And he was joined by some other prominent Frenchmen like François Mauriac. Maritain penned an essay with this title, De la Guerre Sainte, on holy war. Defining a holy war as, I quote, a war elevated above itself to the order of grace and consecrated to God, Maritain explains how the fundamental prerequisite of such a war is that it must first be just. Donating stolen money to the poor cannot count as merciful almsgiving. Similarly, a war waged unjustly cannot count as a holy war. Here, Maritain cites the many atrocities that were carried out by the nationalists, not only in the heat of the moment, but out of a concerted plan, the bombing of Guernica as a case in point. And not only were these atrocities committed, they were rejoiced in. There's a famous account of a slaughter, and the soldiers afterwards went to Mass. It was on the Feast of the Assumption, and sang the Te Deum. So Maritain trots a lot of this out. In another line of argument, Maritain attacked the claim made by another Thomist, that Franco's main purpose in waging the war was to save religion in Spain and indeed in the whole world, in allusion to the spread of communism. Apparently, Eric Trump has similarly made the claim that his father alone is up to the task of saving Christianity in America. But at least Eric Trump can be excused because to my knowledge, he's not a Thomist. All right. Now, anyhow, in response, Maritain asked rhetorically, "Is God so in need of our help to preserve His religion among us? Wasn't it by the blood of the martyrs that Christianity advanced, not by the tip of a sword?" Maritain took the analysis a good deal further when he proceeded to ask whether the very idea of holy war can have any valid applicability for Christians in the modern age. He alerts us that this question engages key points in the philosophy of culture and theology, points that are of the utmost importance for all of modern civilization. Here he is referring to holy war as defined by him earlier, namely an activity that would be a direct emanation of sanctifying grace, an act elicited by charity, as Thomas would put it. The medieval Christians thought of the Crusades that way. Hence the indulgences and other spiritual benefits that the faithful would receive for their participation in such a war. I would add that this question of holy war's applicability has lost none of its actuality in our own day. It's true, we talked about this a lot apropos of Islam. But lately, we have seen a revival of holy war discourses in Christian milieus, where they had seemed all but extinct 10 years ago. Think of Patriarch Kirill's statements about Russia's metaphysical struggle against an anti-Christian decadent West. Kirill avoids the term holy war, but the meaning is, the basic meaning is very much affirmed. Think of Steve Bannon's explicit invocation of the Crusades as a model for Christians to follow today in our confrontation with Islam. Or think of Pentecostalist invocations of spiritual warfare against evil as justification for physical combat in the temporal sphere. I met a pastor, Nigerian pastor, who was missing a hand. And I couldn't help but ask him, what happened to your hand? And he said that he'd been engaged in this sort of spiritual Pentecostalist, he didn't use the term, but inspired activities, burning mosques. And, he'd have a lot, and this sort of back and forth, they'd burn a mosque, then they would burn a church. So he renounced all of that. He said that was a grave error. In examining the status of holy war in relation to Christian thought and practice, Martin argues that while it might have had legitimacy within a sacral conception of political society, this can no longer apply among the conditions of secularity that characterize modern Christianity's relations with the temporal sphere. Martin maintained that under the historical conditions of modernity, a new model of the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal, church and state, would have to be elaborated. This model could not be premised on a pure and simple separation of the two orders. Rightly understood, the two should be conceptualized in vital interaction with each other, but within a modern instantiation of Christendom, shared theological faith would no longer provide the primary bond of unity between citizens, nor would the temporal order be valued simply for its instrumentality vis-a-vis our spiritual end. Fundamental Christian truths should still be reflected in the temporal order, but here they function more as sources of inspiration for the promotion of human dignity than as constitutive elements of civic unity. By contrast, on the medieval sacral conception, because the temporal polity was thought to derive its unity from a shared faith, the polity itself was deemed to have an inherent religious value. Consequently, attacks against the polity, the Christian polity, were, by extension, taken to be attacks against the faith. By extension, those who took up arms to defend the polity were viewed as doing so out of religious commitment. You see the line of reasoning. Their militant activity could thus be considered not only just, it was thought to be holy as well. As I've explained, St. Thomas, like his commentaries, worked within this sacral concept of Christendom, hence the idea of militant martyrdom that I spoke of earlier. For Martin, the Habsburg Polish victory over the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna, 1683, was the very last historical manifestation of the medieval holy war. Appealing to holy war now, within the confines of post-Enlightenment modernity, is not only to err. Even worse, it inflames religious strife and brings Christianity itself into discredit. Regrettably, we find Christians today, even Catholics, trying to revive the sacral conception of Christendom. Think of the Jericho March that preceded the Capitol insurrection on January the 6th. Or more recently, consider the book written by two Trump supporters who described the former president's critics as, here's the title, desecrators. That's the book's title. Its subtitle is telling, Defeating the Cancel Culture Mob and Reclaiming One Nation Under God. Neither the Jericho Marchers of January the 5th nor the authors of the book just mentioned specifically endorse political violence. But we must be mindful how shooting wars are often preceded by culture wars. That happened in Spain, happened in Argentina, happened in Chile. And how denigrating others in the name of faith is to walk down a dark road, again, as the experience of Spain, Argentina, and Chile have shown, and other places as well. In 1939, Martin was sent by the French Foreign Ministry to the U.S. His mission, unpaid, but with his travel expenses covered, was to defend in Catholic circles the Anglo-French declaration of war against Germany. Étienne Gilson, the other great Thomist, undertook a similar mission. At the time, many Catholics were isolationists and promoted neutrality. A small group even leaned in favor of Nazi Germany as a bulwark against the communist threat represented by Soviet Russia. In connection with this mission, Martin penned 2 essays. The first, entitled La Juste Guerre, Just War, dated 29 September 1939, very soon after the declaration of war, was published while he was still in France, but it appeared in Commonweal magazine. And the other, the Christianity and War, was read by him at the New School in New York City in April 1940. Both were subsequently published in a volume of his wartime writings, Pour la Justice, for justice. Appealing to the language of just war was highly unusual at the time. That's something hard for us to grasp, because we think of the Second World War as the paradigmatic case of a just war. But people didn't talk that way back then, because they thought that just war was an obsolete idea. It had been replaced by international law, Kellogg-Briand Pact and the League of Nations and so forth. Even though Martin acknowledged much value in Gandhian methods of nonviolence, he had written an essay on the topic, he insisted that nonviolent methods would have little efficacy against Nazi aggression, as in his eyes, only armed force could stand a chance of prevailing against it. In Martin's words, justice is not disarmed. In characterizing the just cause at stake, Martin emphasized how this was no mere national war to press Franco-British claims against Germany. But the Czechoslovakian crisis had intimated, and the invasion of Poland had made crystal clear, how this war was not simply about one nation attacking another. Rather, it was about a broader agenda of aggression, which had the elimination of bedrock moral and spiritual values in Western society as its main aim. To counter this aggression, there was needed, in Martin's words, a just war on behalf of civilization. By the same token, however, he took care to deny that this war could be deemed holy, perhaps against some Frenchmen on the far right who had urged a crusade or holy war against Soviet atheism, including Martin's boss at the Institut Catholique, the rector at the time. In rejecting a framing of the Anglo-French war effort explicitly in terms of religion, Martin discouraged church leaders from actively endorsing the war effort. Church leaders. Doing so might lead back to the old idea of holy war, and with it the equivocal idea that shedding blood can be considered holy. War, Martin writes, war represents an extraordinary rupture between the natural order of things here below and the order of divine mercy. Nowhere more than in war does God seem absent. Nothing is more antipodal to the inner life of the church, the kingdom of God that begins on earth and reaches its fullness in heaven. Nothing is more antipodal to it than war. Consequently, by reason of their task, church leaders must never promote war, even under circumstances when a war might be justified. It's by reason of their role that Martin maintains this. I believe considerations of this sort have motivated Pope Francis to shun the term just war. As for him, justice is a biblical term that signifies integral goodness and thereby includes the order of grace. Martin also gave careful thought to the specific war aims that should animate the Allied war effort. He conceded that the Versailles Treaty had been gravely flawed. He acknowledges that the Allied victors had poisoned the German people with the illusion that their nation alone was to blame for the terrible harms brought about by the First World War. Martin maintained nonetheless that the issue of just cause must be decided not by the remote origins of a war. If you look at the remote origins, there will always be a reciprocal sharing of guilt. Rather, just cause should be determined by reference to its proximate cause. And I quote, the immediate purpose and motive that determined it, namely in the case at hand, the aggression of which Poland had been the victim. Here, the responsibilities were not mixed, but unilaterally fell on one side. With this focus on a wrong that had actually and already been committed in real time, not in a distant past, Martin deliberately refrained from describing the Allied cause as preventive in nature. Germany had not yet attacked France and Poland when the war was declared. So Martin resisted this idea of describing it as a preventive action. This became a bone of contention with his close friend Yves Simon, who insisted that France should have preventively attacked Germany when it remilitarized in the mid-1930s. But Maritain would have no truck with the pagan principle of preventive war, as Suarez had termed it. I will note in passing that the issue of preventive war has become newly relevant in the Ukraine conflict. Putin has framed his special military operation, he now calls it a war, as a preventive measure to impede Russia's encirclement by NATO. That's one of the rationales Putin has given. And some friends of Ukraine have argued that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, then the Baltic republics, Moldova, and maybe even Finland, Sweden, and Norway will all be at risk. So Ukraine's allies should take military action now or supply Ukraine with the necessary arm to secure Russia's defeat. The contention is that this is not just a matter of containing Russia or rolling it back to its internationally recognized borders with Ukraine, but of defeating Russia, under the supposition that this is an armed struggle not only on behalf of Ukraine, but for us all. We're not doing it for their benefit, doing it for ourselves as well. Because if we don't do it, Russia will eventually attack us. To my mind, this tacit appeal to preventive war is not without prudential and even moral risk. It makes assumptions about Russian intentions and forecloses on a diplomatic solution to ending the war. With Maritain and indeed the mainstream of just war thinkers, we should be wary of such reasoning. Regarding right intention, Maritain distinguishes the determining motive of a just war from the usage of victory. The determining motive signifies removing an imminent evil that pacific means were unable to remove. In contrast to Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a 20-year-old university student, had criticized the Anglo-French declaration of war as vague and dangerously unlimited. "We are fighting," she wrote, "against an unjust cause, indeed, but not for a just one." End of quote. Maritain urged in a letter, by contrast, Maritain urged in a letter to the French foreign minister that the war aims should be explicitly spelled out. But in articulating the war aims, Maritain astutely, and he proposed what he thought the war aims should be. Interest of time, I'll leave that off. But in articulating the war aims, Maritain astutely took up the challenge that had already been raised by the young Elizabeth Anscombe. She worried that imprecise war aims would lead to mission creep. And I quote from Anscombe, "If our intentions are so unlimited, there is no point at which we could say to our government, 'Stop fighting, for your conditions have been satisfied.'" It's quite admirable she could formulate it so well at the age of 20. As to the usage of victory that I a moment ago contrasted to the determining motive of a just war, Maritain insisted that an Allied victory should not involve a simple return to the antebellum status quo. Acknowledging how deep social injustice, flawed governance, and pernicious political outlooks, not just in Germany, but in France as well, had led to Europe's violent undoing, he thought it imperative to wage war with the ultimate aim of reorganizing civic and international life on more solid foundations. In this connection, he reflected on a set of issues that today would go under the heading of transitional justice. Throughout the war, Maritain cautioned against the cultivation of hatred and vengeance vis-a-vis the German people. And this was a real issue. You know, in Britain, they conducted hate training for soldiers because they felt that they didn't have enough, they wanted to give them more lift vis-a-vis the German, and they needed to hate the Germans. So Maritain cautioned against this sort of thing. To forestall a demonization of the other, he reminds his fellow Frenchmen that in the concatenation of causes that led to the war, all bore a burden of guilt. True, the lead perpetrators of Nazi crimes should receive their due punishment, he argued, but Germany, once disarmed, should regain its rightful place among the peoples of Europe. Recognizing that a vindictive peace would only prepare the way to new wars, Maritain, as early as November 1939, began promoting the idea that at the war's close, Europe should reconstitute itself as a federal union with Germany and France at its core. Maritain had originally intended to write a book on war and political justice, but he set aside this project after the invasion of France in June of 1940. He turned instead to other more pressing tasks. His book, À travers le désastre, Through the Disaster, sought to refute the defeatist narratives then promoted by apologists for the Vichy government. And the book was disseminated published clandestinely in France, disseminated widely in the country and also in Poland. In his radio messages to the French public, aired weekly via the BBC, Maritain also took up these same issues. After the war, Léon Blum, who had been leader of the Popular Front and socialist prime minister under the Third French Republic, told Maritain that these broadcasts had been a rare source of hope during the long period he spent as a political prisoner in the Buchenwald concentration camp. He'd managed to smuggle in a radio. Throughout the decade that runs from the Spanish Civil War through the Second World War, Maritain provided an exemplary Christian witness, one worthy of emulation today. He did so precisely as a public intellectual. His purpose was not to promote an ideology, but to exercise judgment on matters for which there are no simple answers, but where it was essential nonetheless to take a clear stand based on principles of Christian natural right. Last December, I was in Rome for a workshop at the University of St. Thomas, better known as the Angelicum. The Hamas-Israel war had just entered its third month and was very much on my mind, as it was for many of us. Having some time to spare, I took a stroll around the Pantheon. At the urging of my son Andreas, I ventured into the nearby Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where a relic from St. Thomas's arm may be found. After pausing for a moment of recollection before the altar dedicated to St. Thomas, I was attracted by the tomb of St. Catherine of Siena, situated beneath the main altar. Walking behind it, I could see that pilgrims were invited to write down their prayer intentions for placement before St. Catherine's remains. What should I pray for, I wondered. This intention entered my mind. St. Catherine, please help me acquire discernment so I can judge rightly about war. This prayer was prompted, perhaps, by St. Raymond of Pennafort, the great canon law theorist of self-defense, who likewise has a side chapel dedicated to him in the church, the Basilica. Perhaps it was inspired by something I had read in the Summa. Discussing prudence, St. Thomas maintains that alongside the right judgment needed for our private lives, we also need to exercise sound judgments as members of the political community. The inner source of this sound judgment is what he terms political prudence, a virtue that is both intellectual and moral. We need this virtue, each and every one of us, precisely insofar as we are citizens of the polis, and Aquinas calls it the res publica. A special virtue is needed because achieving sound judgment in this domain is never easy. Many obstacles stand in the way, social media among them. More than an upright will is requisite. Education leading to trained understanding is needed also. For this, we must carefully pick our role models and receive direction from them, hence my selection of guides for today's talk. I'm grateful to the Institute for Human Ecology for providing me with this opportunity to speak before you, and I applaud its valuable work in promoting a culture of prudentia politica in the spirit of St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you very much.
And your phone is here. There you are. All right, well, hard act to follow, obviously. As I was introduced a little bit earlier, I have written extensively on geopolitics in the medieval era, and I have written a lot about the constitutive norm of sovereignty, which is connected to war in the medieval era. And yes, I've also written a novel, The Holy Lance, about Knights Templar and the way in which what I tried to convey in that novel was I tried to capture and reflect what it meant to be a spiritual order committed to war. Like, we don't make that connection ordinarily anymore, but it was a real thing. The Hospitallers, obviously the Templars, the Teutonic Knights, etc. There was a whole bunch of military orders. And I tried to inhabit the skin, as it were, of the Knights Templar to try to reconcile, make sense of the way in which just war, that theory of just war, crystallized in that institutional context all of those centuries ago. I'm not going to talk about the novel. I have a full-time job. I don't need to sell the thing anymore. Thomism Goes to War. In conversation with our speaker tonight, what does that mean, Thomism goes to war? For me, it means this, that based on the works originally of St. Augustine, who, by the way, was not named after a city in Florida, and whom my Protestant friends always refer to as St. Augustine. He's St. Augustine. Thomas Aquinas, building on that tradition, on that foundation, really invented the notion of just war. Not holy war so much, although that was in the air at the time, but just war. And the just war idea, which we can talk about in terms of jus ad bellum, when is it legitimate and just and right to go to war, under what conditions? And jus in bello, how do you actually justly conduct wars once you have, for just reasons, once you have embarked upon a war? What can you do? How can you apply political violence? What are the limits? What are the constraints? What things are you not allowed to do? Thomas Aquinas invented, for all intents and purposes, invented that idea of just war. And it really crystallizes in a particular way post-1945, I think for obvious reasons. Right? When is it okay to go to war? And once you're going to war, what is it okay to do and what is it okay not to do? But having said that, I want to draw something of a distinction between the just war theory of Thomas Aquinas' time, the Crusades in particular, and just war theory post-1945. Just war theory post-1945 gets reframed as international humanitarian law. Right? There are things you can do. It's a legal frame, and it's very narrow. Post-1945, you can only really legitimately go to war in self-defense. There's no other legal, moral, ethical justification for war post-1945, based on the experience of pre-1945. 2 world wars, which were launched, perpetrated by aggressors who were not fighting the war for the simple purposes of self-defense. They had other goals, other objectives, other things they were trying to accomplish. But if you go back to Thomas Aquinas' time, and if you go back to the Crusades, there is a different justification for going to war. It's not about self-defense. It's about righting a wrong. And the way in which Bernard of Clairvaux and people like that justified the Crusades was to make this argument, that once upon a time, the Holy Land, as they framed and characterized it, was Christian. It was the birthplace and the crucifixion site of the central figure in Christian history. And from their perspective, it was illegitimately, unlawfully seized by Muslims. And that, I'm not passing judgment. I mean, history is history. It unfolds the way it does. But the way they framed and understood it was that this was a wrong that had to be righted, and it was perfectly legitimate to use armed force to right that particular wrong. So when we think about the Crusades, we can frame it as settler colonialism and imperialism. That's not the way, though, that Christendom, now we call it the West, once upon a time we called it Europe, but originally it was called Christendom. That's not the way Christendom framed and understood just war. They understood it as undoing a wrong, and that's the Crusades that's a complicated phenomenon, and the First Crusade is different from the Third Crusade, is different from the Ninth Crusade. There's lots of things, there's lots of moving parts, lots going on there. But the story that the Europeans, Christians in the Western world told themselves was that this was a just war because it was undoing the wrong that had been done to Christendom when the Arab armies forcibly conquered and annexed the Holy Land. Talk about settler colonialism. That would be a different talk. Having said that, when we fast forward to post-1945, that notion of a just war, which shades into the idea of holy war, because the way in which the Crusades were framed was not just that they were morally correct, it was that there were all kinds of spiritual rewards to be had if you engaged in this kind of war. Remission of sin, et cetera, all kinds of good things, at least as people in those days understood them. Fast forward to post-1945, we're not in that world anymore. So although Thomas Aquinas lays the predicate for our contemporary understanding of just war, we can't really, I don't think, understand the contemporary understanding of just war simply by asking ourselves what Thomas Aquinas thought a just war was. Because history has a weird way of imposing itself. Let's just put it that way. And after 2 world wars, the Europeans, Christendom, the Western world, however you want to characterize it, decided that that wasn't going to happen again, and simply delegitimized what had been an understanding of just war in the 19th and early 20th century. That you could go to war for all kinds of reasons, and you could justify war in all sorts of ways. They decided to draw a line under that. Henceforth, post-1945, legally, and I think culturally, the sense was you could go to war, but only for the purposes of self-defense. That's the jus ad bellum, the justice of war, right? When is it okay to go to war? I think that's a huge shift that happened in the 20th century. And then the question of jus in bello. What are you allowed to do once you're engaged in a just war? What kinds of violence can you perpetrate? What kind of armed force can you apply? Against whom? And again, Aquinas, laying the predicate many centuries before, helps us understand that, because a distinction gets made initially and provisionally by him, but then it evolves over time, that in a war, you can apply organized political violence, but only against combatants. Ideally, people with red tunics or blue tunics or bright their uniforms, you know who they are, they're the bad guys, it's okay to kill them. But it's also okay, if that's what you're trying to do, to inflict, to use a term I'm so tired, my fingers are cramping from doing this constantly. Collateral damage. If your goal is to take out enemy combatants and you happen to kill or maim non-combatants, that is not a violation of justice according to the European, globalized, but originally European and Christian, notion of just war. It's not nice, it's not good, but it wouldn't be framed as unjust, a violation of the jus in bello rules. And that kind of brings us to questions which I hope we pursue. I'm going to draw a line under my comments now, but I hope we get to pursue, is not so much the war in Ukraine, but the war in Gaza, which the Israelis have been framing as, this is a war of self-defense. We were attacked. And nobody in their right mind could doubt that. There may have been deeper reasons. Politics is always complicated, but nobody can doubt that the Israelis were attacked on October the 7th. So they're framing this as a legitimate war of self-defense. And then the second move that they're making is to frame the way they're conducting the war as, we are simply going after the Hamas combatants. And unfortunately, as we're doing that, because of the way Hamas embeds itself in the local population, et cetera, now I'm not saying that this is true or untrue. I'm just reporting what the Israeli government is telling us. Their argument is that if you look at most of modern history, the ratio of combatant deaths to non-combatant deaths is not any different than it is in Gaza at the moment. The Israeli line of argument is that according to this just war tradition, Thomism goes to war, invented by Thomas Aquinas, although evolving over the centuries, that they are perfectly within their rights to be conducting the kind of war they are, even if tens of thousands now of innocent civilians, the latest numbers are about 26,000 Palestinians killed in this Israeli campaign. Let's assume, and this is a big stretch, let's assume that 10,000 of those are Hamas fighters. That's still 15,000 innocent people, mostly women and children, who have been killed in this campaign. If we are going to have some metric, I'm Canadian, so I don't say yardstick, I say metric. If we're going to have some metric against which we can judge the justice and the propriety in war and of war, the Thomistic legacy really is all we have at the end of the day. It's really that metric, that yardstick that we have, that we would hold the Israelis accountable to, or Hamas accountable to, or Russia accountable to, or anybody else. The only yardstick we have is the Thomistic yardstick. I think that's a valuable legacy, because otherwise it's, to quote Thomas Hobbes, a war of all against all. We have to have some rules, and the rules we have inherited, for better or for worse, are the rules laid down by that wonderful Catholic theologian, Thomas Aquinas. And with that, I will cede the podium to my colleague and friend.
Okay. Oh, I was gonna set a timer. Because otherwise, right, we'll never stop. You put professors in front of a microphone and an audience, right? It's a dangerous thing. So I had some difficulty thinking about what I would say, because when I read Professor Reichberg's text, I found that I didn't disagree with his central argument, which, as I take it, is that we have to be careful not to allow our passion for a just cause or our passionate love for our country to blind us to the ways in which that kind of love can move us to places where we lose the opportunity for negotiation and for reconciliation and ultimately for peace. And if the justification for war is ultimately to fight in the name of peace for a more just and well-ordered post-war world, then we have to be careful, right, not to let those passions that motivated us to go to war in the first place to undermine, right, our present. And I thought it's particularly telling, right, that we can start to think, unfortunately, in the United States about the time before war, right, about polarization and its intensity and our love for our particular political teams, right, and how that love can also transform itself into something very toxic. So, since I can't disagree, I thought I might share with you some thoughts that his talk inspired me to think about, namely about the way his talk ends with a cogent reminder that we need to exercise sound judgment as members of the political community. And to do this, I think, we need the virtue of political prudence, as Professor Reichberg said, a virtue that is both intellectual and moral. So far, I'm just repeating him. But I think there's an aspect of the virtue of political prudence that we don't always remember to think about, which is that political prudence is also fundamentally emotional, both in the sense that our moral emotions help point us in the direction of what is right and turn us away from what is wrong, but also in the sense that political prudence requires us to pay conscious, careful attention to the way in which our emotions can misdirect us, overwhelming both our intellectual and our moral judgments. Moral emotions are emotions that encourage social behavior. The idea that emotions link our moral intuitions to our behavior is a very old one. Augustine valued emotions, seeing them as potential connections to God. Emotions could serve as a powerful tool for differentiating the praiseworthy from the condemnable. Thus, right, he argued that if we try to navigate the risky complexities of our earthly existence without any access to our emotions, as for example the Stoics would want us to do, there would really be something wrong with our life, he said. And it's not just because emotions are fun to experience. It's because emotions, right, some of them are not so fun. I have teenagers, right? But emotions are also something that's pointing us, right, in the direction of what is just and what is unjust if we know how to listen to them properly. Aquinas, similarly, valued emotions as markers of what is suitable and what is repugnant and hurtful. In both our animal and intellectual appetites, love is a marker of the harmony between our appetite and what is good, while hatred marks a dissonance. And therefore, Aquinas argues, just as good is the object of love, so evil is the object of hatred. In other words, that emotion we feel when we see civilians bombed in Ukraine or in Gaza, and that emotion we feel when we see civilians kidnapped by Hamas fighters, that emotion of anger and hatred is not bad. That's an emotion that points us in the direction of justice, which is in the opposite direction, right, of those images that we see. As Leon Kass put it, this repugnance and anger can thus be the emotional expression of deep wisdom, beyond reason's power to fully articulate it, because we intuit and feel the violations of things we rightfully hold dear. In other words, emotions are a sort of moral sixth sense, alerting us to situations and choices that are morally risky, helping us to feel the presence of, sometimes even before our intellect can quite pick up on it, injustice and evil. However, recognizing that our moral emotions can be useful guides does not mean allowing our emotions to govern us. Passion can be a powerful motivating force, helping us to accomplish great things, but misdirected passions directs our wills and energies away from the good with just as much vigor. As Augustine put it, if the will is wrongly directed, the emotions will be wrong. If the will is right, the emotions will not only be blameless, but praiseworthy. In this sense, emotions are thus partly a product of the will, which is not often, right, in 21st society, how we think about them, right? I have a story about that, but there's no time. For Augustine, we can think about how the will interacts with our emotions in two senses. First, a well-cultivated will, the will of someone who trains themselves and their minds to seek the good, is unlikely to experience misdirected passions. As we come to learn and love what is right, our passions also come to aim in that direction. And if our will were to be completely harmonious with God's, our passions would never stray. But Augustine also imagined the relationship between the will and emotions in a second way, one which does not require such a high standard of perfection. We can use our intellect to interrogate our emotions. Misdirected passions may wash over us, we're only human after all, but we don't have to wallow in them. We can let them go, recognizing that they're problematic, that they come from our animal impulses or that they come from misdirected loves, and refocus on the good. Anger is one emotion which seems to be ever more present in our civic lives these days. With partisanship in the United States at a fever pitch and the so-called culture war in full swing on many sides, there's a lot of anger and tension. We hear anger in the words of politicians and would-be politicians every day. Social media influencers of various stripes profit from our anger, as do the social media platforms themselves, because anger sells. Statistics show we're more likely to engage with material online that makes us angry than cute cat videos that make us laugh. There's a psychology for this. Anger often seethes through interviews ordinary citizens give journalists, where anger about the economy, about the immigration, about social change or the lack thereof appears as the motivating reason for their political and social views. And we hear anger at our own dinner tables, especially at holiday gatherings where we try to negotiate a hyper-partisan political landscape with those nearest and dearest to us who, thankfully or not so thankfully, we see only on rare occasions. And most likely, we find ourselves buffeted by all that anger too. To feel anger is not, in itself, the problem. After all, anger is one of the moral emotions. Anger can be the alarm bell that alerts us to injustice in a situation or relationship. But anger is, in Aquinas' view, also a double-edged sword. Anger is properly the name of a passion, he tells us in the Summa Theologiae. And the passion of the sensitive appetite is good insofar as it's regulated by reason, whereas it is evil if it sets the order of reason aside. Let's break this down for a moment. Our anger can end up being disordered in two different ways. First, it's possible for our anger to be directed towards the wrong things. As a passion, when properly directed at an evil, anger motivates us to avenge. I struggled with that word, right? Does it motivate us to avenge or revenge or for vengeance? But I decided on avenge. In other words, Oxford English Dictionary says avenge means, right, to judge, to protect, and do justice. Those three forms of things we sometimes don't think about as all being forms of one constant idea. But all of those are ways of setting back the clock or resetting the clock away from a moment of injustice towards a moment of restored justice, whether that is by judging the wrongdoers, right, by protecting those who have been wronged, or by doing justice, right, and restoring those right relationships. This kind of anger, Aquinas tells us, is zealous anger. But Aquinas warns, if one desires the taking of vengeance in any way whatever contrary to the order of reason, for instance, if one desires the punishment of one who has not deserved it, or beyond his deserts, or contrary to the order prescribed by law, or not for the end of maintaining justice and correcting faults, then one engages in sinful anger. Sinful anger is anger that does not emerge out of love and care for our neighbor, but rather out of envy and hatred. And sinful anger thus has more to do with our own desires for glory, for power, to see, right, the bad guys punished in the end, than it does with justice. Second, it's possible for us to express anger, even rightfully held anger, in the wrong ways. Aquinas warns that the movement of anger should not be immoderately fierce, either internally or externally. If our anger burns too hot, it will be sinful, even though just vengeance be desired. Augustine uses the term lust to describe an over-intensity of anger, and in fact identifies it as the fundamental sin that is in war. For Augustine, the sin in war is not the killing, and the horror of war is not the dying. After all, we're all going to die, right, in the end. And if we believe, right, in heaven, then death itself, right, is not the end. The thing that's wrong in war, Augustine argues, is the immoral emotions that it generates in us. Hatred of the other, the loss of the ability to see them as someone who could be loved, desire for the wrong things, desire for glory, right? Desire to kill in and of itself, right? Rather than to kill as an act of protection. When we are too angry, when we're filled with rage, we can go too far. We punish more than is needed to correct the wrong, and instead punish to make ourselves feel better. In so doing, we ourselves become instruments of harm. Although punishment for Augustine and Aquinas is fundamentally an act of neighbor love, we ought to want the wrongdoer to change their ways, not for our benefit, but so that the wrongdoer themselves will be transformed. In this way, punishment is not backward-looking, but forward-looking. It should ideally create the possibility of reconciliation and well-ordered justice in the future. The punished should be able, in an ideal world, to rejoin a well-ordered society. Okay, so by now you're wondering, what does all this talk about emotions and anger have to do with the political prudence I alluded to earlier? When we think about the wise counsel Jacques Maritain offered during some of Europe's darkest decades, it's clear he was offering a way around that excessive and misdirected anger. Yes, the Spanish Republicans had done great harms, insulting God and the church, targeting the innocent. And yet, Maritain argued, those wrongs should be accounted for, including by the use of force. At the same time, Maritain decried the Francoists not only for failing to take care of the vulnerable, but for massacring the vulnerable, for invoking the language of holy war to carry out decidedly unholy acts. From Reichberg's reading of Maritain, one can imagine him saying, it's not wrong to be angry about the way Republican forces behave. It's not wrong, right, to hold the opposite political view than the Republican forces. It's not even wrong, right, to be furious that the Republicans' war aims are what they are. But to allow that anger to become unbridled rage that burns everything in its path is, for Maritain, the road to Guernica and not to justice. Similarly, Maritain urged Catholics to recognize that fighting against Nazi Germany was a just cause, a necessary war. It was even, in his view, a defense of civilization itself. But it wasn't and couldn't be a holy war. He decried the demonization of the German people and proposals for a vindictive peace, concepts that make sense if the war is holy, but not if the war is merely necessary. This measured response to one of the greatest evils of modern history reflects, I think, exactly what Aquinas was getting at in thinking about the productivity of anger. It's not that Maritain denied the existence of evil. He recognized it. It's not that he denied the obligation to fight against it. He recognized that too. But instead, he denied the idea, right, of allowing that pursuit of the defeat of evil to become something all-consuming in itself. In other words, Maritain modeled what it means to direct our anger at an appropriate end without committing excesses. Such a balance is not easy to strike. Modern psychology tells us that negative emotions are felt even more keenly than positive ones. If you don't believe the psychologists, just try to think back on the last major emotional event that you had. It might have been just a few minutes ago, it might have been yesterday, right? It will almost certainly not be a happy one, right? We feel anger and hatred and disgust more intensely than joy and love. This makes it all too easy to allow our anger to go to excesses, demonizing our opponents themselves, labeling them as the evil that we hate. When we do so, we misplace our hate, putting it onto our fellow humans rather than onto the wrongs that they commit, which is what we should rightfully direct our hatreds towards. And this pushes us farther away from any possibility of negotiation or reconciliation. After all, right, how can you negotiate with evil? How can you negotiate with those who you hate, right? You can negotiate with someone, a human, who does those things, right? But not with, right, someone who's actually evil. We might also think about this in the sense in which our anger and hatred, when we sum it up, right, and saying that our cause is just and I'm so angry about the other's cause, gives us an over-sense of confidence in our justice, makes us feel less humble than we probably should about our certainty that we know, right, that our particular chosen aim is the right one. On a closing note, if it's difficult enough for us to restrain our own anger and to direct our own anger towards what is truly just within the bounds of just restraint, it's perhaps even more difficult for us to respond justly to the over-the-top anger of others. Thinking through Aquinas' guidance on the moral emotions may work very well as an inward-looking practice, helping us to be better versions of ourselves, but can it help us think about how we should respond when we are the target of others' excessive rage, or even when we witness our friends falling victim to excessive rage? I'm not really sure how we should respond when we're the target of others' excessive rage other than with patience and charity, so I'll leave that at that. But I think something very interesting that is worth thinking about is how we witness our friends falling victim to excessive rage and what we are meant to do about that. This is a question of vital importance for the United States, for citizens living together in a hyperpartisan era. It's also vitally responsible as we think about what our obligations are towards allies like Ukraine and Israel. So let's think a minute about friendship and Aquinas. Aquinas thought more and wrote more about friendship than other Christian theologians up to his time, who had preferred to talk about relationships with Christ and God in terms of family rather than friendship. Friendship matters for Aquinas, and he tells us that among worldly things, there's nothing worthier to be preferred than friendship, for it's friendship which, bringing virtuous men together as one, preserves and promotes virtue. None of us, he tells us, in the discussion on truth, have full access to what truth is. If we put those two ideas together, that friendship is a matter of us building each other up and encouraging each other to live up to our highest virtues, and the recognition that none of us carries all of truth within ourselves, which means our friends carry some angles of truth, some perspectives on truth that we ourselves fail to see, then friendship can be a way, right, of pushing each other away from excessive anger, away from misdirected anger, and towards the good. But that's not easy. Our obligations to our friends, our duties towards our friends, involve not only care and support, which Aquinas emphasizes, right? That together with a friend, nothing is quite so intolerable. But our obligations to our friends also involve truth-telling, or put in the opposite direction, perhaps more provocatively, we demonstrate care and support for our friends through truth-telling. Speaking truth in the name of restraint can be difficult. When our friends, or our families for that matter, take positions that lead them away from restraint and away from positions of restrained anger that make negotiation possible, it can be difficult to know how to intervene. So I'll end with a personal anecdote, right? Something as an ethicist, it's sometimes difficult. You walk through the world and you struggle with thinking, okay, so I have a great paper to write about this, but actually living it up to it is going to be really hard. So in the community that I follow on Twitter, I've become internet friends with a large number of Ukrainians. And as their homes are bombed, as their families' homes closer to the war zone are shelled, right, by Russian forces, they, rightfully so, experience anger. They sometimes experience rage. And I'm even coming to the point of view that rage itself is also not, right, a problem, that it can be a moral emotion telling us that this is a really, really big injustice. But sometimes that anger and rage transforms itself into a way of speaking about Russians in general that is not conducive to the peace that we hope will come in the future. Similarly, when trying to talk about, right, Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response in bombing Gaza, it's a conversation that's incredibly politically fraught. And understanding that the other's moral emotion, the anger that those with whom we're having those conversations about may be coming from a moral place, but that it may be excessive, might be a way of trying to negotiate those conversations with empathy and care for our interlocutors, with humility in our own sense of whether we are sure that we are right about our views on any one of these political issues or anything else for that matter, and a way of leaving the door open to the kind of restraint that the Thomistic just war tradition encourages us to have. If there's anything that's at the core of the tradition, it's the idea that we should pursue justice, but we should pursue it within limits, limits that make possible the reconciliation and peace the day after. Thank you.
So just to remind you, I'm not Dan Philpott. Dan, unfortunately, is stranded in Chicago, but he did send his remarks, and so I'm going to read them now. I want to focus my remarks on Dr. Reichberg's claim about the natural ends of war, and in doing so, we'll touch on some of the other strands of argument. Dr. Reichberg's argument against holy war, or war fought for supernaturally informed ends, is a sound one, and I briefly offer some reasons that elaborate why. Temporal authority or government is purposed to temporal ends, goods that instantiate flourishing in this life. Norms of justice govern the right pursuit of these ends, for instance, with respect for human rights and human dignity, and with fairness. The political common good is the shared good of a people in pursuit of these ends. The spiritual authority, that of the Church, is ordered to eternal ends, union with God and with activities, sacraments, and worship that are ordered to these ends. War is an activity conducted by government authorities for these ends, chiefly to defend a political order and its common good from attack. In medieval times, it was thought that war could be fought for retribution or punishment. Today, the tradition also allows war to defend the human rights of people in other countries violated on a large scale. My sense is that Aquinas himself viewed war as being chiefly for temporal ends. The defense of the Pope was of an authority who, in addition to his spiritual role, governed his own lands. And even wars in the Holy Land were fought arguably to liberate this land from external conquest, though in each case a supernatural dimension can be added to the ends of armed struggle. That's first point. Second, Dignitatis Humanae rules out most of the traditional wars for spiritual ends. It rules out wars for evangelization. Magisterial teaching had always held that faith could not be forced through coercion. Aquinas ruled out the use of coercion towards eliciting the faith of one who was not a Christian, say a Jew or a Muslim. But more openness can be found, as with Vittoria, towards wars that would defeat obstacles to evangelization. More commonly, Catholic authorities fought wars to maintain a realm that was officially Catholic and where non-Catholics could be coerced on behalf of the good of the realm, which was tied to a common religious faith. It is this purpose of coercion that Dignitatis Humanae, the declaration of the Second Vatican Council, definitely rules out. It proclaims religious freedom of individuals and associations as a natural human right. It also teaches equal citizenship under the law for people of all faiths, granting every person, regardless of his or her religion, the equal set of rights, duties, and privileges. Warfare across or within borders to preserve a realm in which non-Catholics are restricted in their practice of religion or in any way rendered less than equal citizens is ruled out. Third, it is also worth remembering that it is the natural law character of the just war ethic, as well as human rights, that have enabled these ideas to be such a powerful influence on contemporary international law and institutions, able to secure global consensus. I wish to raise the question, though, whether there still may be a sense in which supernatural ends might be folded into our thinking about the justice of war. One sense to consider is the supernatural orientation of a faithful Christian soldier. In Aquinas' discussion of virtue in the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, he argues that the Christian, having received sanctifying grace, has a new end in all of her actions, that of glorifying God, a supernatural end. In the past couple of decades, moral theologians such as William Madison, Angela Mackay Knoebel, and Jean Porter have explored this, and in the context of the infused moral virtues, infused justice, infused temperance, and so forth. I accept the argument of these scholars that a Christian has a single final end, while I would add that he retains basic or intrinsically desirable natural ends, which are directed anew towards the final end of God. For instance, a Christian might perform a piece of music for the glory of God, in which case music is still an intrinsic good, not a merely instrumental one, but is now directed towards God. This sense of achieving a natural good for God may lie behind the interesting decision of Pope Francis to expand the notion of martyrdom to include Christians who are killed performing acts of faith, even if they are not killed for the faith per se. A Christian serving the poor in a dangerous locale, or who stands up to the mafia, or for human rights, the human rights of the oppressed, and is killed for it, for instance, may now be considered a martyr. In the case of the Christian soldier, one could imagine a soldier fighting a just war for natural ends, the defense of his country, yet who orients her actions to God. In the course of combat, this soldier might also perform certain distinctively Christian acts of mercy or sacrifice on the basis of her faith, even while participating in a war order to natural ends. This proposal for incorporating the supernatural into the fighting of war, I suspect, is one that Dr. Reichberg would not disagree with, as long as we maintain that the purpose of fighting the war is a natural one, and is not to maintain or expand a sacral state. His central concern is the ends of war, not the motivations of Christians fighting it. Yet I would like to expand the place of the supernatural in the fighting of war even further, and propose that there are defensible ways of incorporating supernaturally defined ends into war. I certainly do not mean to resurrect war fought for sacral orders, the kind that Dr. Reichberg rejects. We live in the era of dignitatis humanae. As Augustine and Aquinas argued, a just war is fought for a just peace. The justice and peace for which war is fought are centrally and necessarily natural ends, defense of a political order, the human rights of persons. I want to argue that certain supernaturally revealed obligations can and ought to define and expand the meaning of just peace and the end for which war is rightly fought. I came to this conclusion through many years of studying and working as an activist in societies facing pasts of war, dictatorship, and genocide, South Africa and Germany, Northern Ireland, and El Salvador. What I discovered over and over again in these societies' debates over the past is that religious leaders spoke and advocated differently from officials of what might be called the international community, diplomats, international lawyers, and human rights activists. The international community voices advocated the restoration of rights and the rule of law. Their ultimate ideal was the judicial punishment of arch criminals, the purpose of the International Criminal Court. Religious leaders spoke differently. Their overarching theme was reconciliation, and they thought of this in terms of healing, repair, enabling people to live in villages together after a conflict, apology, and forgiveness. No future without forgiveness, Archbishop Desmond Tutu entitled his book. I eventually concluded that the two groups had different ways of thinking about what justice is. The international community thought about justice in terms that reflect the dominant concept in the West in recent centuries, the constant will to render another his due. Due is synonymous with rights, and this is the central concept in the justice of Western societies and in the world's constitutions. Rights are also expressed in retribution, their axial concept for addressing past wrongs. The religious leaders, at least the Christian leaders, thought about justice in terms derived from the Bible. I argue that this justice, translated from the Hebrew tzedek and the Greek dikaiosune, means comprehensive right relationship. Right relationship between persons can involve respect for one another's rights, but also obligations that exceed what rights demand, or what is due, such as generosity, mercy, care for the poor, hospitality, forgiveness, and the will to reconcile. The Apostle Paul uses dikaiosune to describe the salvific actions of God through the cross and resurrection of Christ, thus rendering God's reconciliation of the world to himself as an act of justice. So, when the religious leaders voiced reconciliation as the central goal for societies facing their past, they viewed themselves as promoting, horizontally in the political realm, God's vertical action of restoring the world. In light of Dr. Reichberg's argument, they brought a supernatural end, one that derives from God's action and God's revelation, into the political order. In my work now, I am developing this concept of justice as right relationship in the more general sense, not just for the context of countries facing their pasts. It combines natural and supernatural ends and what is due, or what people have a right to, with what exceeds what is due. Dr. Reichberg quotes Pope Francis along these lines when he argues that for him, justice is a biblical term that signifies integral goodness and thereby includes the order of grace. Thinking about justice in this supernatural sense, I believe, also reflects the direction of the Church's social teaching since the Second Vatican Council. Prior to the Council, I would argue that the Church's magisterium primarily thought about the political order in terms of natural law and the justice of what is due. Maritain's own thought reflects this. Neither the Church nor Maritain ruled out supernatural virtues or norms in politics, but these were sidelined and not well integrated. It is noteworthy then that in Gaudium et Spes, the Council's chief document on social and political thought, we find paragraph 22 saying that, quote, "Only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. Christ, the final Adam, fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear," unquote. Paragraph 22 was a favorite of John Paul II and of subsequent popes. In John Paul II's encyclical of 1980, Rich in Mercy, he discusses mercy, reconciliation, and forgiveness, all derived from God's salvation, and then applies them to the political order where he thought that they could be realized. In 2002, he would append to Pope Paul VI's dictum, "No peace without justice," the phrase, "no justice without forgiveness." In many other ways, he and subsequent popes have brought a supernatural Christological dimension to the Church's teaching on society and politics. I would like to offer a few thoughts on how these supernatural ends and norms could be integrated into the ends of war, the subject of Dr. Reichberg's lecture. At first, it might seem like I had been talking about something other than war, say, transitional justice. Remember, though, that the purpose of a just war is a just peace. And if reconciliation defines justice and justice defines peace, then this can and should be an end of armed conflict. One illustrative example is the aftermath of the Second World War and the creation of the post-war world order. Dr. Reichberg mentions Maritain's favor for European federalism, or what is now the European Union, and contrasts it with the settlement of World War I based on revenge and of unilateral assignment of guilt. One of the fascinating backstories of the creation of this federalism was a set of secret meetings between political and civil society leaders from Germany and France that were sponsored by Christian churches seeking to begin to bring about reconciliation between the warring sides. These paved the way for the European coal and steel community, agreed to in the Treaty of Rome in 1950, the original federal institution. Catholic statesmen championed it, including German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, Italian Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, and others. They looked upon the new community as a vehicle for reconciliation. Coal and steel were chosen as the industries for supranational governance, not because of their economic value, but rather because they were central war-making industries. To be sure, the community was incubated by the new Soviet threat in the Cold War, but this alone does not explain the form that the new institutions took or the people who championed it. European federalism, then, premised on reconciliation, was very much a part of the peace that emerged after the war, along with the principles of international law, economic openness, and human rights. A second example is the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which not only struggled for racial equality and human rights, but also made reconciliation, or living in harmony with whites, a goal of its struggle, one that is derived directly from the Christian roots of the movement's leadership. It was because of the movement's commitment to reconciliation as the end of its armed struggle that once the apartheid government fell in 1990, reconciliation or multiracial democracy would become a major theme of President Nelson Mandela and the country's Truth Commission. In light of these examples, it is worth asking how reconciliation can be incorporated into the just war ethic more systematically, and what it might mean in current armed struggles such as those in Ukraine, Gaza, and Ethiopia. It would be an example of how a distinctively Christian idea may continue to inform the practice of nation-states long after we have left behind the supernatural politics of sacral states. There end Professor Philpott's remarks. I now reclaim my own identity, and I do that for the purpose of thanking Dr. Reichberg again for what I think was a really wonderful and memorable lecture. And I also want to thank Professors Latham and Morkevicius and Dan Philpott for their very insightful comments. And just in closing, I especially want to underline something that Russ said at the beginning, but I want to say a little more about it, and that is to point out the excellence in organizing the event of our wonderful Institute for Human Ecology staff. I can't see because of the lights, but Stephen Higgins is in the back there. He's our managing director. Stephen's logistical abilities, just to keep with the war theme, clearly rival those of the Duke of Marlborough. And we have evidence of this event after event after event. Our program manager, Caroline O'Callahan, is here somewhere. I don't see her. She's already at the next thing. She never stops working. It goes constantly. And that's why we succeed. Aramis Perez, where's Aramis? There he is, has helped out tremendously with this event. And Megan Witt, she's right over there. So I want to thank all of them, and also two people who are not here, but who played important roles in organizing this event. Jean-Marie Leo, working remotely from Maine, and John Henry Hobgood, who heads up our Boston office. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to tell you to stay tuned. We have already recruited next year's Catholic Political Thought lecturer, although I will leave you in suspense as to that person's identity. But I will say that that lecture will take place in October. So please stay tuned for more information about that, and thanks for coming and good evening.